Paul's olive tree metaphor in Romans 11 functions as a covenantal diagram situated within an imminent eschatological crisis, not as a timeless theory of individual salvation of non-Israelites. Notably, Paul introduces only one cultivated olive tree. He never speaks of two trees, one Jewish and one Gentile, nor of a replacement organism. The root of that tree is explicitly tied to the patriarchs per Romans 11:28-29. The life of the tree flows from the Abrahamic promises. As leading scholar James D. G. Dunn notes, the olive tree represents Israel in continuity with the patriarchs and the promises source. Dunn, Romans 9-16, word Biblical Commentary, page 676. Likewise, N. T. Wright explains, the root is the Abrahamic covenant, the story of Israel itself, source, Wright, Paul, and the faithfulness of God, page 1235. The tree, therefore, represents Israel's covenantal identity grounded in Abrahamic promise. It is not an abstract spiritual community detached from Israel's historical narrative. From that group, Paul divides them into two categories, broken branches and those who remained in the tree, then adds those grafted in. Natural branches were Israelites, Judean Jews, diaspora Jews, descendants of the 10 northern tribes and possibly related Israelite groups such as Samaritans, those who belonged natively to the covenant structure. Within that tree, Paul says that some natural branches were broken off because of unbelief per Romans 11:20, while others remained in the tree because they believed the gospel message. Paul has already framed the chapter by asking, has God rejected his people? By no means, per Romans 11:1. The broken branches are not pagans excluded from Israel, they are Israelites judged within their own covenant. This language aligns with the Hebrew Bible's covenant framework, where Israel is repeatedly judged within the covenant through exile, loss of inheritance, and removal from the land for covenant violation. See, for example, the covenant curses in Deuteronomy 28, the olive tree judgment imagery in Jeremiah 11:16-17, and various prophetic warnings in Ezekiel. Paul's image of branches being broken off, therefore, reflects familiar covenant judgment language applied to Israel herself. Jeremiah 11 actually contains a direct olive tree metaphor. The Lord called your name a green olive tree, beautiful with good fruit. But with the roar of a great storm he will set it on fire, and its branches will be broken. Source, Jeremiah 11:16. That passage is very close to Paul's imagery in Romans 11. Paul describes wild olive shoots being grafted into the cultivated tree per Romans 11:17. In Isaiah 5, wildness describes corrupt fruit produced by Israel herself, showing that prophetic agricultural imagery often reflects covenant faithfulness rather than ethnic origin. However, Paul's metaphor in Romans 11 is not identical to Isaiah's imagery. Isaiah speaks of wild fruit produced by Israel itself, whereas Paul speaks of wild branches grafted into the cultivated olive tree. The metaphor, therefore, acknowledges a difference of origin, but places the decisive emphasis on covenant standing rather than lineage. Notably, Paul is not quoting or citing directly from Isaiah 5. He is likely drawing from familiar horticulture to form his metaphor. In ancient horticulture, a wild olive tree was one that grew outside the cultivated orchard, so the metaphor indicates branches originating outside the historic covenant people. However, Paul's emphasis is not on ethnic origin, but on covenant participation. Those grafted in stand by faith per Romans 11:20, meaning that inclusion in the tree is determined by covenant faithfulness rather than ancestry alone. Rather than a second tree or a separate people, Paul's metaphor seems to portray outsiders being incorporated into Israel's covenant structure. This potentially could include synagogue-associated God-fearers and proselytes and other Gentiles who were attached to Israel's God but not native to the covenant lineage. The metaphor most naturally fits people who were already connected in some way to Israel's covenant world. In the Second Temple world, Gentile was not always a clean biological distinction. Shea J.D. Cohen explains that the Jew-Gentile boundary was always crossable and not always clearly marked source. Cohen, was Judaism in antiquity a missionary religion? Harvard Theological Review, page 13. Cohen also says, in the eyes of the Gentiles, the proselyte has become a Jew. Source, Cohen, The Beginnings of Jewishness, page 140. That means legally and covenantally, a proselyte was no longer considered a Gentile outsider. They were incorporated into Israel. Proselytes were legally regarded as Jews, and synagogue-attached God-fearers occupied a space of covenant proximity. Paula Fredrickson notes that diaspora synagogues were open to outsiders, including pagan sympathizers who attached themselves to Israel's God. Source, Fredrickson, Paul, the pagan's apostle. Thus, the category of wild branches therefore coherently includes covenantally attached outsiders, proselytes and God-fearers, without requiring biological descent from Jacob. Herein lies the real tension in the metaphor that scholars often note. Proselytes could plausibly relate to both sides of the imagery, depending on which aspect of identity Paul is emphasizing, origin or covenant status. If the focus is origin, proselytes would resemble the wild branches. In the metaphor in Romans 11:17, the wild olive shoot is a branch that comes from outside the cultivated tree. A proselyte, by definition, began life outside Israel's covenant people and later joined Israel through circumcision and Torah observance. From that perspective, the horticultural logic of the metaphor fits. A branch that originates outside the orchard but becomes attached to the cultivated tree. If the focus is covenant standing, proselytes would resemble the natural branches. In Second Temple Judaism, a full proselyte was legally regarded as a Jew and treated as part of Israel's covenant community. Scholars of ancient Judaism repeatedly note that conversion created a new covenant identity. A proselyte was no longer a Gentile. They were understood to have become a Jew. Once incorporated into Israel, they could function socially and legally like any other member of the covenant people. Because Paul's metaphor distinguishes origin, natural versus wild, from covenantal standing in the tree, faith versus unbelief, proselytes sit at an interesting intersection. They originate outside the cultivated tree, but become part of the covenant structure once incorporated. Paul's main point, however, is not to classify every possible social category with precision, but to emphasize the decisive criterion: continuing participation in the tree depends on faith, per Romans 11:20, not ancestry alone. The metaphor, therefore, allows for people whose origin lies outside Israel, yet who participate fully in Israel's covenant life once grafted in. The idea that only physical descendants of Jacob could be grafted into the tree encounters serious textual and historical difficulties. First, Paul never appeals to hidden tribal lineage in Romans 11. He never mentions Ephraim, Assyria, or lost genealogies. Instead, his criterion for standing in the tree is explicit. You stand by faith, per Romans 11:20. If ancestry were decisive, Paul's emphasis on faith as the determining factor would be inexplicable. Second, conversion in Second Temple Judaism demonstrates that covenant membership could be conferred apart from biological descent. Shea Cohen states plainly, in the eyes of the Gentiles, a proselyte has become a Jew. Source, Cohen, The Beginnings of Jewishness, page 140. If covenant identity can be granted to those without Jacobite lineage, then descent alone cannot be the controlling principle of the olive tree metaphor. Third, Paul warns the grafted branches that they too may be broken off if they do not continue in faith, per Romans 11:20-22. That warning presupposes a conditional covenantal participation unfolding in real time, not a static recognition of hidden ancestry. In other words, Paul did not warn them that if their ancestors were discovered to be non-Israelite, that they would be broken off. He warned them that if they did not have faith, they could be broken off. He even adds that those same Israelites could be grafted back in if they do not continue in unbelief, per Romans 11:23, indicating that the issue is specifically their response to the gospel message rather than their ethnic identity or membership in Israel itself. The entire discussion is framed within Israel's eschatological horizon. Paul situates his argument in what he perceives as the climactic moment of Israel's story. He speaks of Israel's acceptance as life from the dead, per Romans 11:15, language widely understood as corporate restoration imagery. Scholars broadly recognize that Paul believed he was living in the last days. Dale Allison notes that early Christian eschatology reflects an expectation of imminent culmination source. Allison, Jesus of Nazareth, Millenarian Prophet, 1998. Paul himself writes, "The night is far gone. The day is at hand," per Romans 13:12. The olive tree metaphor belongs to this unfolding crisis. The covenant tree is being pruned and resolved before its impending climax. When Paul declares, "All Israel will be saved" in Romans 11:26, the referent follows directly from the argument of the chapter. Hardened Israel, plus the faithful remnant reconciled within the same covenant body, which could include Jews and others connected to Israel's covenant world. As Dunn explains, Paul's hope is for Israel's corporate restoration source. Dunn, Romans 9-16, page 690. The phrase does not expand to encompass every human being, nor does it refer to an abstract spiritual category detached from Israel. It describes the covenant people reaching resolution within the eschatological moment Paul believed was unfolding. Taken together, the olive tree is a covenantal schematic operating within a first-century apocalyptic horizon. The tree is Israel's covenant identity. The root is the patriarchal promise. Natural branches are native Israelites, people who belonged natively to Israel's covenant tree. Broken branches are unbelieving Israelites removed from covenant privilege. Wild branches are non-native but covenantally attached participants brought into the same tree through faith. Being broken off and grafting in described covenant standing during an eschatological refinement, not biological life and death or post-mortem destiny. Romans 11, therefore, does not outline how the world acquires a religion through adoption or grafting in. It is Paul explaining how Israel's covenant story, rooted in Abraham, fractured by unbelief, expanded through faith, and pressing toward imminent resolution, reaches its climactic fulfillment within his own generation and concerned only those within Israel's covenantal structure. In summary, the natural branches were Israelites, those who belonged natively to Israel's covenant people and therefore to the olive tree rooted in the patriarchal promises. Among those natural branches, some remained in the tree because they believed the gospel message, while others were broken off because they rejected it, per Romans 11:20. Those grafted in were people who did not originate with Israel, but who had become covenantally attached to Israel through lawful means, and who were incorporated among the branches on the basis of faith in the gospel. In this way, the covenant tree came to consist of believing Israelites and covenantally attached participants together within the same patriarchal promises. This is the culmination of Paul's argument in Romans 9:11, which is why Paul concludes in this way, all Israel will be saved per Romans 11:26.